Matt Taibbi, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you so much for being back on. I really do appreciate it. And this is actually your seventh appearance in the show's history. So,
Is it really? Wow. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, again, I just want to thank you for all of your years of support and coming back on the show. And, there's a lot I want to talk about today, the election, and I want to talk about the Twitter files a bit too. But the big breaking news over the last couple of days has been Ukraine firing these long-range missiles into Russia. And I remember back the first few times that you were on the show, we were talking about Russiagate and this neo-McCarthyism and sort of this road that we were going down. And from my perspective, it kind of seems like we've continued down this road where this Russia fear mongering has literally brought us on the verge of World War III now, where Russia is saying that they are considering this to be an attack by NATO into Russia. So, what are your overall thoughts on that trend and just again this breaking news that we're having now about Ukraine launching these attacks deep into Russia?
So I got a message from a friend who lives in Moscow still this morning. It was just a couple of words that said "check Russian news," and there's they took the news that there's a little city called Karachev, about 130 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, that got hit by a bunch of U.S.-made missiles today. For the first time in Russia's history, they've been attacked by American weapons on their territory, and they took that pretty hard. The Russian media has been kind of alternating between mocking and strident in their responses to the American presence in Ukraine, but today I think the tone was a little different. Than they changed their nuclear doctrine today as well, lowering the standard, allowing for a response to not the previous standard was a threat to the very existence of Russia. Now it can be a threat to the territorial integrity of Russia. And I'm of two minds about this. On the one hand, I think Putin, who can be completely irrational and does things that are crazy. The invasion of Ukraine was something I didn't see coming, and I think it's indefensible. On the other hand, my entire history going back to the early 90s suggests, and this has been something that I've talked about with people who were there from that period forward as well, from the American diplomatic community, that we had an opportunity to do things differently in terms of how we dealt with post-communist Russia. And we treated them from the very start like they would be inevitably an enemy again, which I think made this situation predictable. We could have brought them in as a kind of strategic partner in the same way we did with Japan or Germany after World War II, and we chose not to do that. And I think now we're seeing a dangerous situation as a result.
Well, again, we kind of did for a while, right? Like I remember Bill Clinton having Yeltsin over and them laughing and whatnot, and it seemed as though it really started under George W. Bush, where we started to see these missile treaties getting ripped up. There was, allegedly the involvement of the U.S. in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. We also, it was Bush and Cheney who kind of announced that Ukraine and Georgia was going to be joining NATO. So what's
But
really confusing to me is the Democrats and how they've shifted, because you can even go back to the 2012 election where Obama was mocking Romney, and actually all the Democrats were mocking Romney in the 2012 election, saying that the Cold War was over. But it just seems as though something changed in 2013-ish, where they became these, Cold War era Russia hawks.
yes, well, that was when the situation really started to escalate in Ukraine. But I think it goes back earlier than that. I mean, there was a big moment in the late 90s when a group of, I think it was 50 American senior diplomats and like Sovietologists signed a paper protesting the expansion of NATO because it would result in the dissolution of START 2 talks. And that was a moment when a lot of the people who were in the expat community in Eastern Europe felt that we were prioritizing the expansion of NATO over some other things. And at the time, Russia was not really a threat to anybody. It was, economically a basket case. It was broke. It didn't, it still had weapons, but apart from that, nothing really. And there was also a moment where we could have gone in, and this is something that's been, stressed by some of the people from Harvard who were economic advisors, that we had an opportunity to do like a Marshall Plan kind of rescue of the economic situation very early, like in 90 or 91, and we kind of told them to go, you know, uh, that they would have to fend for themselves. And looking back, I think maybe those were mistakes, but certainly you're right. Yeah, there's been an escalation, at least in rhetoric, in since the mid 2010s, and especially after Obama got heavily criticized for not intervening in Crimea.
So why do you think that the Biden administration has approved these strikes after the election like this? It's really odd timing where, there seemingly was a repudiation of their administration's foreign policy, amongst other things. And now, when it's a lame duck administration, basically, they're pushing us to the verge of World War III. So do you have any thoughts on the timing around this?
I I can't think of an explanation for it that isn't political and therefore doesn't make it completely irrational and crazy. Again, the Russians are taking this very differently than it's being taken here in the States. In the States, it's just one of 90 crazy things that people are dealing with in the news. But over there, they're showing maps, on national television, showing the range of the ATACMS missiles and showing how they could reach Petersburg and maybe even Arkhangelsk, right, like far into Russian territory. People are freaking out. Like there are senior military advisors are saying this is the very last red line there is to cross. There are no more lines that we can permit. And so to take this drastic a step after, while you're on your way out, I can't think of a good reason to do it unless there's some kind of strategic opportunity they're not telling us about. But I find that hard to believe, personally.
I mean, some people are kind of characterizing it as it's an FU to Trump, where they're
Right.
basically, bring us to, as close to World War III as possible, if not actively in it, and then handing him the administration, handing him the White House.
Yeah, it's like you break it, you own it, but it's going to be the next administration that's going to own this problem, and it's already going to be, at DEFCON 1 by the time he gets into office if things continue on this pace.
Well, again, I know it's hard for anybody to kind of predict how Russia would react to this, but do you have any thoughts? Again, we had this news about these cables getting cut. Do you think that we could be potentially seeing cyber attacks? Do you think that small NATO members along the border of Russia are at risk of being attacked, or just what are your thoughts on how Russia may retaliate?
There was a lot of discussion today about non-nuclear states and states that are allies of nuclear NATO powers that could be targeted. So I think what they're talking about is Ukraine, and then also countries in Western Europe that could become targets as proxies for the United States first. That seems to be what they're hinting about. But I think what Americans have to understand, and I'm not excusing this at all, I'm just kind of trying to explain the psychology, having lived there for so long. The Russians have been invaded from the West repeatedly throughout their history. There are still echoes of the things that country has gone through over the years, and the centuries. In relatives who are still surviving members of the Leningrad blockade, things like that, and they are extremely paranoid about this stuff in the way that Americans are not, because we've never dealt with anything like this. So, however you think, however extreme their reaction might be, that you might guess at, I'd probably add one or two to that equation, because there are just historical factors in play here that are definitely on their minds.
What's been kind of frustrating too, is looking at the liberal media and influencers and just regular people, I guess, on social media, and they seem to not really get the severity of it. I don't know if they just don't understand what nuclear war means. I think a lot of them maybe think that, Russia's nuclear arsenal probably isn't what it used to be. And, they point to things like, why is Russia having North Koreans fight for them and using, Iranian drones and whatnot? So, I think that's probably part of it. But do you think that there's a certain point where they're just going to get it and understand, oh, we're at the verge of all life on the planet Earth being extinguished?
Well, we never did a great job of educating the public in this country about the dangers of nuclear weapons. And, there are people who will tell you, I have a good friend who worked in like physicians for nuclear safety, for instance. It's like one of the big anti-nuclear groups who cataloged all the different horrible accidents that we've had in the nuclear era. Things like warheads rolling off the decks of ships, warheads being misplaced, flown to the wrong cities, going down with sunken subs and nearly going off. And then we've had things like missiles flying into Russia, which nearly triggered a response twice. We had an incident in the early 80s when the Russians almost answered what they thought was an attack on their territory. And then again, early in the 90s, when I was there, there was I believe, a Scandinavian rocket that was a weather something or other that Boris Yeltsin decided not to return fire at the last minute. So we've had these like near civilization destroying events many times, even outside the Cuban Missile Crisis. But you're right, that for some reason we've just decided to not educate an entire generation about this particular threat. I mean, I grew up watching those duck and cover movies and The Day After and things like that. Everybody was very conscious of nuclear war in the 80s and 90s, and now I don't think people are for some reason. Do you have an explanation? I don't really understand it personally.
Yeah, again, it just seems to have kind of gone out of the popular culture, right? Because it was in so many movies from Doctor Strangelove to Terminator to War Games or whatever, and it just seems to not be in people's consciousness anymore, where they don't really think about the fact that we have thousands of nuclear warheads pointed at us.
Yeah, no, and as for them being maybe old and outdated and not working, I mean, I think that's a vain hope. One thing the Russians do well is build sturdy weapons. I mean, you can drop an AK-47 in a riverbed and pull it out 50 years later, and it will still work. They they may not look great, but I think their nuclear arsenal is still highly functional, and they built a hell of a lot of them. And this again, I think, was a mistake we made in the 90s. We had an opportunity to kind of reduce everybody's nuclear arsenal and didn't do it. And, now we're in the situation, which is, I think, easily the most dangerous since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well, let's take a, best case scenario approach. Let's just assume that this dies down for whatever reason, and Trump comes into office, and he starts détente with Russia, and things go in a positive direction. Where do you see this trend of Russiagate and Russophobia that we've been seeing for the last decade or more? Where do you see that going during a second Trump term?
Well, we've seen a few instances of people trying to revive it already after the election, with the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard, right? We've had a number of people speak out about, oh, we're putting a Russian asset into the DNI's office. Adam Schiff gave an interview the other day saying that there was concrete evidence of collusion to Jake Tapper. So he's now in the Senate, and it's possible they could revive that, but I think that issue is spent politically for the Democrats. They squeezed an awful lot out of it in 8 years, and unless we end up in an actual shooting war with Russia, which I guess we can't exclude at this point, my expectation would be that they'll come to some kind of resolution in Ukraine fairly quickly, and then this will hopefully die down as an issue. I mean, that's what I hope. But there could always be the accusation that Trump negotiated a favorable settlement for Putin, and that will hang over his administration, or they'll come up with some new investigation. I think that's possible, but I just don't think Russiagate per se is going to come back.
Well, one thing that I've been seeing online a lot of since the election is people saying that Starlink was somehow involved with hacking the votes. So that's sort of, the modern incarnation of this that we're seeing. And I know that in the corporate media, we're seeing a lot of accusations against Elon Musk and demonization of him, and saying, if suggesting that he's working with Putin as well. So do you think that that's possibly the next incarnation of this, is that he becomes sort of this focal point of Russiagate 2.0?
I guess, but it's already a little late to start this is an illegitimate presidential win train. If they were going to do that, I think they would have done it already. They kind of went down, I thought, surprisingly, with surprising ease and grace on election night. I kind of expected that there would be some kind of protest about illegitimacy on the night of the election, and that didn't happen. So, but you're right, it could come back. And yes, they have used the fact that Elon has had contact with Putin and Tucker Carlson too, who's also close to the administration. They could use both of those people as ways to suggest a connection.
Well, I'd love to get your thoughts on the election overall, because again, this was just one of the craziest election cycles we've ever seen, from, Biden dropping out to the assassination attempts to, Hulk Hogan ripping off his shirt at the RNC convention. It just was, and, the McDonald's thing, the driving around in a garbage truck. It just was a really crazy election cycle. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as somebody who's covered politics for a while, and just, how Trump was able to win. And again, just what a wild election season this was. But were you surprised by the results as well? Were you expecting him to take all of the swing states like he did?
So I had somebody from the campaign tell me with absolute certainty we're going to win all the swing states before the election night, but I didn't really believe it. And all the mainstream coverage of the polling suggested that it was going to be very tight, and once again I fell for it. I think this is the last time I ever fall for polling coverage, let's put it that way. It's proved to be almost completely useless at this point. But as for why he won, I think there are some pretty clear things that you can point to that were huge unforced errors in the parts of the Democrats, and really made it difficult for Trump to lose. Actually, they conceded, particularly the gender gap. Things like the decision not to go on the Joe Rogan show, that's the kind of error a campaign can't afford to make after you spent $1 billion trying to get somebody elected, because a couple of people in your staff don't want to deal with blowback, and you have a chance to reach 50 or 100 million people in your strike zone of convincible voters. That seemed absolutely nuts to me.
Do you think it could have hurt her at all at that point? Like, if she had just gone on there and made an ass of herself, like, could that have hurt her, or do you think that she had nothing to lose?
Sure, it could have hurt her, but I think at that point they had to know that they were in trouble. And if, frankly, you can't really. Well, I guess maybe the thinking was we won scared the last time. Remember, Biden didn't campaign in 2020. He basically forswore it, stayed home, played four-corner offense, and got elected anyway. But there were significant differences between that race and this one, particularly demographically. He did much better with white men in particular than this candidate did, and they clearly knew that they had an issue with male voters early in this race. They emphasized it constantly. Even back when they picked Tim Walz, they were, their aides were telling people, this is really going to help solve our big problem with accessibility with the male voter and everything. And of course it didn't. So there was that. There was also just odd things like never answering questions that they could have answered somehow. things like how did you actually become the nominee? Why have you changed your mind on certain issues, rather than just cop to it and say, yeah, well, I've made a political decision. They squirmed around with issues like that, and that it just made them look weak, I thought, and made it difficult to capture the vote. There was no reason for a person who was angry at the current situation, at the status quo, to pull a lever for Harris as a change agent, which is what they needed to do, and they didn't provide them with anything that they could sink their teeth into.
So do you think that Democrats will learn anything from this loss, or are they just kind of going to keep doing what they have been doing?
I mean, you've watched this the last 8 years. They react the same way to every setback, where they assume that the problem is that the voters are defective. We had before it was white America is racist. Now it's also Hispanics are racist. Black men don't love black women. Right? These were some of the explanations we heard from high level Democratic Party functionaries. On the night of the election, they. I don't think they've yet come to the place where they needed to come, which is what Bernie Sanders talked about the night of the election, and which is what he talked about in 2016, which is that the party needs to rebrand itself as a party of the working person again. It has gone away from that to such a degree that it's now almost constantly identified with the professional class, upscale, urban voter.
I
And
mean,
that is,
that's where she even gained votes, was college educated whites. That's the demographic she picked up.
well, what does that tell you, right? I mean, that tells you that their messaging was geared in that direction. And they have to know that they can't win elections that way. They after 2016, I was absolutely certain that they were going to completely rethink how they do things, and they instead doubled down and went in this direction of trying to oust Trump through kind of non-electoral means. I mean, there was a very fascinating moment for me when the Supreme Court decided not to uphold the Colorado decision to strike Trump from the ballot. And there were all these pundits who came out and said, well, I guess we have to win the election now. As if that wasn't what you always have to do in a democracy, right? People had placed their hopes on some other way of getting rid of this guy, and you can't do that. You have to, Trump's not this, unbeatable political figure. He's a hugely flawed candidate, and they could have done so much more to get to the voters that they need to get, just by showing a little bit of effort to listen a little better, and they didn't do it. I don't think. Do you think? I mean,
Well, especially not on the economy, I'd say, because I think most middle class and working class people would say that the economy has sucked for the last couple of years. But you just keep hearing from the corporate media, no, it's good because the stock market's doing good. These job reports have been good, even though they keep getting revised down the month after. But the unemployment rate is down. Inflation has come down after going up 20%. So there was just this pushback of no, the economy is good, when the majority of Americans, I think, would say it's really not.
yeah, Rachel Maddow, this was her weekly mantra. This is the greatest economy ever in history, and people aren't paying attention. Paul Krugman in the New York Times. I don't know he must have written the same column like 50 times, basically saying these people who think the economy is bad just don't know how to read statistics. And it's a guy who probably doesn't. I think he lives in the Caribbean half the year. Who has no idea what people are dealing with in their real lives.
Well, that's a big part of it too, as you see all these celebrities. I know William Shatner was just on Bill Maher's show, and he was saying, like, don't these people understand the economy is great?
I don't know why the Democrats lost. I don't understand why the Democrats lost.
Well, people will be writing books about it for years, many reasons. Part of it was, Biden should not have stayed on so long.
That I understand. But inflation, prices have come down. The economy is good. I mean, I don't know why they voted against her,
Well, I mean,
against the party.
And it seems to be, this millionaire class who thinks the economy is doing fine because they don't really notice the increases at the groceries. But, for the average Americans, household credit card debt is at an all-time high now because people are just swiping their credit cards to buy food.
Yeah, and which gets them deeper and deeper into the hole. And obviously, the inflation problem. Even if you had more inflation in 2021 and 22 than you had this year, it's not like they've made that inflation go away. It's
Right. Prices didn't go down.
right. Yeah, exactly. So, there are real problems. And look, Trump may not be better on these issues, but he's better at the messaging of it. He talks about he tells that story, which is probably apocryphal, about the woman who wants to buy 3 oranges or 3 apples and only buys 2 in the end, or whatever it is. Then, he does things like work the shift at McDonald's. And these are all signals like, hey, working America, I'm listening to you. And whether he is or he isn't, they weren't really doing it on the other side. They weren't even pretending to be, on the side of that voter. And this is a problem that I think the party's been plagued with for quite a while. It's just that they've finally, it's catching up to them now in a big way.
So do you think that they will respond to that and go with more of a Bernie Sanders AOC approach, or, talk about that sort of economic populism, or do you think that they're just going to continue going down this road of talking about J6 and Russia and all this other nonsense?
I would have thought that losing to Trump twice would do it, that you would be the wake-up call that you need, but I haven't seen any indication that the party as such is willing to re-examine its kind of core beliefs. You saw a few criticisms from a few individuals, people like Seth Moulton, for instance, and Bernie, talking about the faulty nature of the campaign. But for the most part, I don't think so. They've really worked hard to kind of turn this into a party of kind of upper class urban elite, the educated voter. They're actually proud of that. Remember, this is something Hillary Clinton talked about. Our voters produced 73% of America's GDP, or whatever it was, and it's this idea that somehow our voters are better than your voters, so therefore we deserve more votes, or something like that. It's ingrained in their thinking. They really don't want to. It's almost like they have an aversion to the idea of going out and courting votes of people in places that they think are beneath them. I mean, that's the impression they give off. I don't. That can't possibly be true, but it's what it seems like on the outside.
Well, I also wanted to ask you about Trump's appointments, because he's named these figures who he would like to be in his cabinet. And I think my evaluation would be it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's people like Tulsi Gabbard and RFK, but there's also people like Marco Rubio. So I'm just wondering what your general thoughts are on these cabinet picks that Trump has put out there, and if you see any kind of common themes among them, or just what your assessment is overall.
Well, so far, they mostly aren't big surprises. If you just went by the different people who supported him during the campaign, you could have guessed that these were some of the people who were going to get the big cabinet positions. Marco Rubio was the other finalist for the VP slot. My podcast partner and I, Walter Kern and I, we had a source who was kind of in the room during those negotiations when it came down to Vance versus Rubio, and it was very close. And most of the Republican Party establishment wanted Rubio, but the Trump family and a few other people close to Trump preferred Vance. Now, when you made that decision, I think it made it inevitable that Rubio was going to get a very significant post that wasn't the vice presidency. if you were going to give him any post, state is one that I would not be happy about. This is a guy, he's good on some, I mean, he's actually surprisingly, doesn't always offend like my liberal sensibilities on some issues. But when it comes to sort of interventionist policy and war, he does represent sort of the old guard Republican vision, and he is Secretary of State now, so that's something to watch. Also, the State Department was a big player in this censorship machinery that I spent the last couple of years reporting on, and there's an agency that they have, the Global Engagement Center, which was set to expire this December. But if it comes back under Rubio, that will be a signal that it's very bad news for people going forward. So I'm worried about that. But you're right, Tulsi's an appointment that gives me. I know her, and I have a lot of confidence in her as a person. I think she's honest. Bruce Carr at the FCC talking about the censorship issues, talking about going after companies like Google. It's fascinating. I mean, I can't remember a situation like that. It's interesting to watch. But yeah, you're right. Certainly a mixed bag.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Rubio is, and you see this trend over time where Trump has sort of embraced these neocons, right? You have the John Boltons, the Mike Pompeos, the Nikki Haley's, and they seem to run contrary to his more, advertised MAGA isolationist foreign policy. So why do you think he keeps sort of going back to the well with these neocons? And do you think that we saw this again with Bolton, where he really undermined Trump? Do you think that that's a potential that Rubio has as well?
Yeah, possibly. But I would also caution against sometimes with Trump, he's a salesperson at heart, and he's telling you that he's an isolationist and an interventionist at the same time. And what you hear is what you want to hear, is that he thinks forever wars are bad. And that all the wars that we got into in the Middle East were stupid wars. But he'll tell somebody else in the next event, I'm great at war, and everybody's going to be so afraid of us when I get in there that we won't even have these disturbances. And so yeah, I think he's probably trying to be all things to all people sometimes, but. For sure, it's still a little bit of a surprise to me that he pays so much respect to figures like, Lindsey Graham, for instance, kind of the old guard Republican establishment. He slaughtered these people way back in 2016. They were rendered completely irrelevant in the party. If you remember, none of his old school Republican challengers even got close to challenging him for real in that primary. So he could sweep them all out if he wanted to, but he does keep them on. So that's something to watch.
So I do want to go back to what you said about Vance versus Rubio, because I'd love any insight that you have there, because sort of the conspiracy theory that I've heard is that because of Vance's ties to Palantir and Peter Thiel, like that was really what motivated this. And we also, there's sort of a larger trend that we're hearing of people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and these technocrats who have really embraced Trump and are influencing him and could influence his policy decisions. So again, I would love to hear any other insight you have about that VP pick and what your general thoughts are on sort of that conspiracy theory.
So I'm of two minds about this. Number one, Trump did have some very serious financial needs in this campaign. He was still massively outgained by Harris, but what money he did get mostly came from the tech sector and from people like Musk and Thiel, and that was support he didn't have in 2016 and desperately needed. So to the extent that he owes anybody coming into the administration, it's going to be those CEOs from Silicon Valley. And if but I don't think that's what the Vance pick was about ultimately. My understanding of it was that the conversation that they had at the last minute was more about whether a pick of Rubio would undermine Trump's ability to turn out his own base, because he, by that point, was so completely associated with this idea of upending the status quo and dismantling the deep state and, doing all those things. It would have been, I think, politically suicidal for him to pick somebody who was kind of a Washington lifer as his VP pick. And this was the opinion of at least a couple of people who were in the room that day, apparently. So he got some credibility as a hard-charging outsider from the Vance pick. Whether that's rooted in reality or not, we'll have to see. But it probably led to some of the later alliances with people like RFK Jr. and Tulsi, right? Like, I doubt they would have been so quick to jump into Trump's camp if it hadn't been for that choice. This is my impression.
Did you hear anything about DeSantis? Do you know if he was ever in the mix for any kind of VP or cabinet position?
I don't think so. I don't know this for a fact, but my impression is that Trump genuinely doesn't like him. I was on the trail following Trump a little bit last year, and when he was doing that Ron DeSanctimonious stuff, you can tell when he's really leaning into those things because he has a genuine dislike. I don't think he really hated Nikki Haley all that much, although he did turn up the Poconos Cruelty Act on her, probably close to 9 or 10 during the campaign, but it seemed like he really didn't like DeSantis. However, look, that state was really important to him, and since in the stretch run of the election, DeSantis has been an important supporter of Trump. So who knows how that's going to turn out? And the support of the Cuban diaspora in Florida, that turned out to be kind of crucial for him in a number of ways. So we'll see. But yeah, I just think that even DeSantis, he's still not a national figure. That Trump doesn't have any important national institutional ties beyond all those Silicon Valley figures. I think those are the biggest connections that he has to like status quo America. And somebody like DeSantis, he's a big governor, but that's nothing compared to the people who run the companies that have been supporting his campaign.
Well, just on like the personal level, if you'd asked me in the past, I would have thought that Trump hated Marco Rubio. I mean, he was pretty brutal with him during the 2016 campaign. He said that he, was the worst senator in the Senate, and he was special interest. And then Vance also, he was a never Trumper. I don't think he even voted for Trump in 2016. So it was kind of, a little odd to some people that Trump would have picked him as a running mate. So do you have any thoughts there on why Trump, looked past those differences in the past in the case of Vance and Rubio?
Again, I think we have this. I think we have to get past thinking about Trump as a normal politician. It took me a long time to get to this place where I think of him more as like a wrestler or a an infomercial salesman. He'll say anything. He'll toe any line that he feels is appropriate at the moment, and he'll do it with absolute sincerity in the moment. And but I don't think he carries those grudges with him terribly. He's probably going to always carry grudges against people like Jack Smith, because they were trying to put him in jail. But these political things, I don't know that he means it. Even when he's being particularly cruel, he may genuinely dislike some of those people, but it's just not the way it is with a normal politician. Like, just take for instance, Bernie is somebody who has genuine dislikes and likes and can't get past them. He really disliked Hillary, and that put a real edge on his 2016 campaign. And he had a lot of affection for Joe Biden, which hurt him in 2020. Biden was kind of his mentor in the Senate. And, those things were important factors in the way he ran his race. Whereas, I think Trump would shelve all that for sake of any kind of electoral strategy. So I think he's just a different kind of political creature.
So I think part of Trump's secret to his success in this election was the fact that he built this broad coalition behind him. People like Tulsi and RFK and Elon Musk. And again, you had celebrities like Dr. Phil and Hulk Hogan and Kid Rock and Dana White, and Joe Rogan ended up endorsing him. But again, just when you look at this politically and you look at the MAGA movement and Vance being the VP and Marco Rubio and these other folks, what do you think is the future of the MAGA movement after Trump? What does Trumpism without Trump mean in the future? Do you see this coalition as sticking together, or do you see it kind of falling apart without Donald Trump?
Well, I would have said that it had no future without Trump until Vance came along. Vance has turned out to be a pretty capable spokesperson for the same general tenor of politics. It's not quite the same, but it's certainly, a form of kind of populist conservatism or conservative populism, or whatever you want to call it. He's much closer to Trump politically than any of the old school Republicans of the Rubio type are. And what the MAGA movement has turned into is kind of this permanent throw the bums out movement. And it's attracted people across the spectrum because there are so many fears about overreach in so many different parts of the electorate. I think he gets somebody like Tulsi in there because Tulsi's worried about the surveillance state and the growth of the military. She's placed under surveillance by the federal marshals, and RFK gets in there because he's mad at the health establishment, and Trump, is willing to take them on. And he gets all these people who are, and then anybody who's mad at the intelligence services, people like, I didn't endorse Trump, but I think the kind of the stuff that all of us Twitter Files reporters worked on probably helped him to a degree because it exposed the intelligence services and their ambitions on the speech front, and he turned himself into a candidate who said he favored free speech, and that won him votes there. So he's got to deliver, though, on those promises pretty early in this campaign. He's got to actually take a bite out of some of these agencies, and if he doesn't do it in a convincing way, I think there probably won't be a future for the MAGA movement.
Hey everybody, I hope that you're enjoying today's interview. As many of you know, this is part of my spectacular 10th season. I have lots of big guests returning and lots of new ones as well, but I really do need your help to make sure that this is a successful season for Primo Radical. Please do like, comment, share, and subscribe across all different social media channels. And if at all possible, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Primo Radical. For only $1 a month, you can join the conversation and submit questions to all of my guests. So if at all possible, please do consider becoming a patron. Again, I really do want to help this show grow over its 10th season, so please do like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thanks again, folks, for the last 9 years of support, and let's make this a great 10th season. I did actually want to talk about the Twitter files a bit because I haven't had you on the show since you broke that initial batch of Twitter files. And, I have to say, this was really a big moment in journalistic history, I think, because you kind of concretely showed that there was collusion between the federal government and these social media networks, which a lot of people have sort of suspected, but, you kind of proved that. And I think that, history is going to remember this as a really big news story. But just, I'd love to know, because I personally haven't heard you kind of talk about the genesis of this. How did all of this get started? And just if you could kind of walk us through sort of what you were given access to and what you were not given access to.
Well, when Elon Musk bought Twitter, there were rumors that circulated almost immediately among reporters that he was going to open up Twitter's files. So I remember I wrote some kind of column that fall, kind of cravenly offering myself up for the role of somebody who would do that if you ever were to decide to open up Twitter's internal communications. And I don't know, maybe he saw that, maybe he didn't. But when he did get finally move into the offices in San Francisco, basically I got a call from the company kind of summoning me there, and I showed up. It was a very strange meeting. Typically when somebody gives you a reporter information, it's very clear what they want out of the enterprise, right? So you're talking to a whistleblower, the SEC, who gives you documents proving that their superiors covered up cases into, I don't know, Morgan Stanley or Goldman or whatever it is. You know what the source is trying to do. With Elon, I asked over and over, what is it that you want out of this whole situation? And he kept, kind of saying, yeah, I want people to feel more confident that the company is transparent and that, and this and that. But I was never really sure. But anyway, we settled on initially on one story, which was going to be about the Hunter Biden laptop story. And the reason we did that is because there had been public comments from people like Mark Zuckerberg to the effect that, maybe the FBI interfered in the decision to, or urged the companies to suppress that story. And Twitter had famously locked that story up and even locked the New York Post's account. So I got access almost overnight to a huge batch of files related to that and that only.
I'm sorry, can we just, specifically, were you requesting certain files, or this was going through lawyers, or how did that work exactly?
So initially, here's what happened. I proposed that topic first because I was interested in, well, if there's FBI stuff, we'll find it here. And they thought that was a good idea. But the files came to me by way of, yes, a lawyer, ultimately. But that was for Twitter files number 1. And, it looked to me like these were batches of documents that had already been pulled for discovery in some kind of legal case. I never really found out what they were, but there was a lot of emails that all had to do with this one issue. But we didn't find particularly anything terribly damning in that first batch. What really sent the whole project into overdrive was a couple of days later when he brought Barry Weiss in, and then there was Michael Schellenberger in the room and some other people. And at one point they just gave us a couple of laptops and we had access to search for, I think it was every Slack chat for a 9-month period in 2020 and no supervision at all. And it was during that time period that we pulled, all kinds of stuff, and we took every attachment that we could. And that's when we found, the trail to the FBI, the DHS, even the CIA, the Director of National Intelligence. All of those stories came out of that batch for the most part. And then after that, we moved to a new system where every search had to go through legal review. And things were a little slower after that, but we still got good stuff. But I think it was that one 2-week period early in December in 2022 when we got the most important stuff and it was about the issue you mentioned.
Was there ever a time when you thought maybe some stuff was being kept from you, or you didn't get access to everything that you would have liked to, or that there were questions that you had that remain unanswered?
Well, you always have to keep that in mind, right? I couldn't exclude it. My guess was that that was not going on at a high level because Elon seemed not to have any idea of what we were looking at for a while. Like, for instance, it was weeks before he knew we were looking at the FBI stuff. And he would just sort of pop his head into the office every now and then and say, everybody cool, you need coffee, anything like that. Like, that was the extent of his involvement for a while. The lawyers who were eventually doing the searches, I did occasionally think that they were maybe pulling things like privileged documents or things that might have exposed the company to long-term litigation. But all the same, they were still giving us things that were damaging to the company financially. And so I worried about it, but not that much. We also had a discussion early in the process about, well, how are we going to cover this if we don't know what's being left out, right? And so we decided that we were only going to do stories that were confirmable and that wouldn't be significantly changed by the appearance of some other document that might add new context, right? So when we found out that the company was having regular meetings with Homeland Security and the FBI, what else could come out that would make that not a story, right? Once we absolutely confirmed that that was actually the case, that when we figured out that the people who were on the email chain, some of those people were confirming those emails as real, right? So we knew that was a story, and then we just kind of focused on little things like that and tried to keep ourselves to those things. And I haven't told a lot of these stories because I haven't had a chance to yet, but there were a lot of things that we had to leave out because we only had glimpses, and we couldn't confirm the bigger part of the elephant. But all the same, I think we got important stuff doing it that way.
So can you share like sort of any theories that you have or things that you would have liked to have investigated more?
Sure. I mean, we had some suspicions that that there were closer relationships between some of the federal enforcement agencies and some of those NGOs than was being let on. So, for instance, you'd have something like you might have a university anti-disinformation center that would crank out recommendations about content that that would then be passed on to platforms like Twitter and Facebook. And we had indications in some cases that those research centers were either being funded by or were in direct communication with certain offices in the federal government, particularly with regard to COVID. There was a lot of stuff in the area of like how directly involved was the CDC and the FDA and some other agencies in regulating the speech of people online during that period. But we didn't get a ton that we were able to report. We did get some on that. Like there was a bunch of stuff on this thing called the Virality Project that was run out of Stanford. And that was important because it showed that they were willing to discount or de-amplify content that they knew to be factually correct but kind of politically wrong. Like, people who died after they got the shot, but they thought that promoted hesitancy, so they would recommend that that content not be shown. It was that kind of stuff. It was valuable, but it would have been better if we could have proved, or it would have been a bigger story anyway, if we could have proved that that came directly from, a government agency.
Well, one of the things that I saw that was a little bit interesting that Alan McLeod did some reporting on, some other folks talked about after the fact, was that there are dozens of former intelligence officials who work at X and Facebook and YouTube, sometimes in content moderation positions, sometimes other positions. But do you think that, having all these former FBI, CIA, DHS people now working as employees of those companies, do you think that that can kind of lead to the same sort of results, either A, because they actually have, ties to people who are still actively in the FBI or CIA, or just because they're, of the same class and the same mindset?
Yeah, absolutely, that's a problem, and it's the same thing as the stuff that I used to write about with banks, where you'd have, the former head of the SEC would be the lead partner at a corporate defense firm that defends all the banks, right? So the bank hires that firm. The former SEC chief is now your advocate. They go and they work out a backroom deal with the agency, and that's how everything kind of gets done behind closed doors. This was like the content version of that, where we were clearly seeing situations where you'd have these former officials who had worked in the National Security Council or the FBI or the CIA. Not the CIA so much. A few of those. Actually, there were actually more than a few CIA people. And then whenever there was a big controversy that would come up, it would be those people who tended to shout down the ones who wanted to resist whatever the government recommendation was. So for instance, with the Hamilton 68 episode, which was this thing where there was this NGO that was putting out what turned out to be a phony tracking system for what Russian bots were following that day. Once Twitter internally figured out that the thing was a hoax, they wanted to out it. The people who did the figuring out said, this is really messed up. We can't let people think that this is real, because there were hundreds of news stories that were coming out of this thing. But it was all these ex-officials who kind of said, look, politically, we kind of can't afford to do that. And that was how that thing never became public. So yeah, there were definitely a lot of those things, and that's probably a major factor in why the companies are the way they are now. We were shocked when we first started to look through the LinkedIn histories just of the people who were in the email chains we were on. We were like, oh my God, like 1 out of every 2.5 of these people has been some kind of spook. It was really, really strange.
Well, I'd love to hear just your overall thoughts on how things progressed after the Twitter files. I know that, obviously got a lot of press because it was a big story. You were called before Congress. I believe you also mentioned that some IRS may have shown up at your house as well. Can you just talk about sort of the aftermath of the Twitter files, and also, what you think, the short-term and long-term impact may have been?
Well, yeah, I did testify before Congress in March of 2023, and I think that was actually, a significant moment. There were a lot of people who watched that, and the way the Democrats went after me and Michael Schellenberger in that hearing was so distasteful to a lot of people that I think they may have lost votes just from that hearing.
Mr. Chairman, Americans can see through this. Musk is helping you out politically, and you're going out of your way to promote and protect him and to praise him for his work. This isn't just a matter of what data was given to these so-called journalists before us now. There are many legitimate questions about where Musk got the financing to buy Twitter.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett, members of the Select Committee, thank you for having me today. My name is Matt Taibbi. I've been a reporter for 30 years and a staunch advocate of the First Amendment. Much of that time was spent at Rolling Stone magazine. Ranking Member Plaskett, I'm not a so-called journalist. I've won the National Magazine Award, the I.F. Stone Award for Independent Journalism, and I've written 10 books, including 4 New York Times bestsellers. And while I was testifying that day, an IRS agent came to my house, and I later learned that the case against me was opened on the day that I dropped a pretty big Twitter file story. It was Christmas Eve before that New Year. So that was
They
That was
opened the case
disturbing.
on Christmas Eve.
Yep, yeah, the case was opened on Saturday, December 24th, 2022.
Wow, those guys are really committed to their jobs, huh? Jeez.
They really are, yeah. And it's funny because I thought there's no way this is related, right? When I first found out about the IRS coming, I thought there's just too stupid for the IRS to try to send somebody to my house to, I don't know, intimidate me into not doing a story. Like, what's the point of this? But when I got the report back from Treasury through the House Weaponization of Government Committee, and they showed me all the documents, but when everything was filed and what the issues were. I mean, they were looking up to see if I had a carry permit, if I had like fish and game licenses. I mean, it was a really weird packet of information they had looked up on me. That was a strange thing. It was unsettling for the first time, I would say, in my career. But the only thing I'd say is subsequently, you know, we did a lot of work after that on trying to uncover more about how this whole state censorship apparatus worked. And this went hand in hand. There was a Supreme Court case called Murphy v. Missouri that did make it to the Supreme Court. It was sent back to the lower court, but it still brought a lot of attention to the censorship issue. And I think, you know, I do think it had a role in the last election, because a lot of people, according to the polls anyway, were concerned about free speech, which they weren't even a couple of years ago. So, you know, I'm not sure how to feel about that, because I didn't, you know, the objective for me wasn't to get Donald Trump elected. The objective was to, you know, uncover more about this censorship thing. But I do think, you know, we did succeed in at least making it something people were aware of, which was good.
Yeah, I mean, I think it became, you know, a major issue. We saw it in the vice presidential debates when they were asking Vance about J6, and he started talking about social media censorship. So, you know, it's definitely become a major issue. And again, I think because you broke a major story. So, so yeah, Matt, I know we've been going for an hour. Do you happen to have any time for a few quick patron questions?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All the patrons of Primo Radical can submit questions to guests, just $1 a month. First one is from John McCarthy. He says, "You have done so much on free speech and censorship. Are you familiar at all with the Hero 3 case? They were convicted in September of conspiracy for speeches, articles, and petitions. Sentencing is in December, and they face up to 5 years in prison. This is the most important free speech case in the courts. Why aren't more people talking about it?" Have you heard about this case?
Yes, yes, I am very familiar with that. I talked to some of those people too. Yeah, yeah. That should absolutely be getting more coverage, and it was weird that it didn't get more coverage from kind of the traditional press, I would have thought, but you know, I guess that's to be expected because of the involvement of Russia. Like, nobody wanted to touch it, or the theoretical involvement of Russia, but. Yeah, that's a fascinating case. I didn't know sentencing was coming up that fast. So, but yeah, I am aware of it, and I would like to write about it at some point.
So next question, and this relates to Twitter files. Why did he decide to work with Undead FOIA to reverse engineer the Twitter files? Is it because he believed the Twitter files releases to be a limited hangout? Does he think Twitter cherry-picked what they gave him?
Well, we didn't reverse engineer what? What did he say?
To reverse engineer the Twitter files.
Well, no, I mean, so what I've been doing with Undead FOIA is basically sending a gazillion FOIA requests to every state-funded anti-disinformation research center in the country to try to find out what relationships they have with agencies like CISA or the Global Engagement Center or the FBI or the FITF, and you know, just basically just try to learn more about how these groups are funded. The genesis of that was that there was a moment in the Twitter files where we thought we had a really big story. I mentioned the Hamilton 68 thing, and at one point, I thought we had a pretty damning story about who was funding that, right? And in pursuit of trying to get that story, I hit upon this Inspector General's report that listed all of the contract recipients of this State Department anti-disinformation group called the Global Engagement Center, and they were all redacted. Every single one of the recipients except for 3 were redacted, like 36 out of 39. And I thought that was so weird. Like, why would this have to be a national secret? And so we just decided at that point, let's figure out who all those people are, if we can, by sending out FOIA letters to everybody we think might be a recipient. And so that started it. We were looking for who were the funding recipients for this State Department, basically. But that led us into all these other back alleys having to do with Homeland Security and other things. And it's been, we still have tens of thousands of pages of stuff we haven't released yet because I'm just too slow to get to it. But it's been a real education, and he's been great just in terms of like keeping up with court filings to make sure that we're actually getting the things that we were owed. And this is one of the things that people don't know about journalism. Like, it's a slow, grinding process. Even after you get a good story, you have to do this stuff that takes years sometimes to get the full picture. And so that's what we're doing there.
Somebody else wanted to know about another Trump pick that we didn't talk about. That's Matt Gaetz for Attorney General. Do you have any just general thoughts on that pick?
I don't know him at all. My understanding is that there are even some Republicans who have some reservations about him, but he also has a reputation for being his own person, smarter than you would think. And look, we've had a succession of attorneys general who are basically almost interchangeably the same kind of person. Veterans of a couple of big law firms in Washington and New York. Senior partners who've worked with all the biggest pharma companies and banks and so on. I mean, what can it hurt to interrupt that conga line at some point? Maybe there's a bigger downside in terms of inexperience that I'm seeing, but I don't really know. I mean, I guess I should just no comment it, but my larger observation is the attorneys general that we've had have not exactly covered themselves in glory to the point where I'm going to be horrified by any pick. Let's put it that way.
Somebody also said, judge on Trump felony case abruptly adjourned with no ruling. Opinion?
This is the one about the New York felony case. Yeah. Well, look, I thought some of the Trump criminal cases were more substantive than others. I think they probably could have won the Georgia case. And the J6 case at least had some really interesting issues in it. The New York case I just thought was blatantly political and stupid. I mean, there's, we have the concepts of, what is it, malum and say, and I forget what the other thing is, but it's crimes that are bad in fact, and but bad according to the law. Malum prohibitum and malum and say. This is neither. I mean, it's not even technically against the law to pay off a porn star to be quiet. They just had to invent an offense by calling that a federal election contribution. I mean, it's a stupid charge. I think it ended up hurting them that they filed that case, even though they mentioned him being a convicted felon 10 billion times. We saw the effect that had that made more people vote for him, I think, in the end. So they should have just stuck with the cases that I think were more substantive. And probably to that question, the more significant development was Jack Smith dropping the other case, I think, after the election.
I also had a question about what is Kamala Harris's future. I guess I would, just wonder more broadly, who do you see Democrats kind of going with in the future? Is it Newsom? I can't imagine it's AOC. Like, who do you think becomes sort of the face of the party?
I don't know, but I think that they shouldn't do what they've been doing, which is try to kingmake every time. In this election, they completely obliterated the primary process, and then when Biden bowed out, they used this bizarre backroom deal, Soviet-style method of declaring a nominee. I think they would do better of just sort of letting the political market sort itself out. And
I mean, democracy?
yeah, whatever. Yeah, that thing. Whatever. That's what it's called. When we have a whole bunch of primary candidates and we let them run and let's see who people like, because if there's anything that's been proven in the Trump era, it's that the Democratic Party has an absolutely lead ear for who is electable in this era.
It's because they keep rigging their elections, right? Like rigging their nominations. The last 3 nominations have not really been fair nomination processes.
Right. Well, and what does that tell you? That tells you that they think they can't win and get the people they want in. So, that's a problem. The thing is that you have to be able to win a national election, and if you don't open the whole process up, you get these candidates who aren't tested in that way. And I think they got to go back to that. I mean, they did tremendous damage to their party's reputation conducting the primary the way they did this year. So, and by the way, campaign reporters like me who followed Kamala around in Iowa, we kind of had a sense that this wasn't going to work out because, even with a lot of PR wind at her back in that campaign, she just could not convert that momentum into actual support. She had tremendous problems connecting in real life with people. And, that's a key part of politics. You have to, the person has to be able to communicate from afar with voters. And she hadn't displayed that ability. So you need to let those people rise up out of the process. I mean, think about it. Would the current iteration of the Democratic Party have let somebody like Bill Clinton through in 1991? I mean, he was the 5th choice probably at the beginning of that campaign. If the party had its druthers, they probably would have picked somebody like Tsongas right at the beginning. And you never know what talent is lurking down there in terms of ability to connect with people. So I just hope they go back to doing it the regular way.
Yeah. And again, just what do you think is going to happen with Kamala Harris? Do you think she's just going to disappear like Dukakis or maybe like Al Gore did after 2000?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think she's going to be Jimmy Carter and building houses in her spare time. That doesn't seem to be her thing. The rumor was consistent throughout the last 4 years that she didn't particularly enjoy being vice president. I don't know that she wants to keep doing this. I think it was part of the thing that sank her in the end is that people didn't get a sense that she was really enthusiastic about staying in politics for any reason, compelling personal reason. So my guess is that she's going to go into something that keeps her, close to power, but probably not intimately involved with politics. Maybe she'll go into be a senior partner at a big law firm, which is a path she could easily take and, have a great lifestyle and still be very much involved in the party, but without having to do a lot of work. That's kind of my guess.
She can also go on a speaking tour like Hillary Clinton and make $250,000 speaking fees.
Or $700,000, right? Yeah, exactly. It's although she's probably not going to get money that big right now. But yeah, no, for sure, it's time to make money. They all do that. So.
Yeah. Well, Matt, I really appreciate you being on the show today. Again, it's always a pleasure to have you on, and I appreciate all your support over the years coming back on for these interviews. For folks out there who would like to follow you and support you, how can they do that?
I'm just at racket.news on Substack, so people can find me there. And, thanks for having me on. And I'm very glad to see that your show's still doing well and that you have such a loyal audience. So keep it up, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks again. I really appreciate it, and hopefully I can have you back again on sometime soon.
Sounds good.